Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, and thank you, everyone. Welcome to our session today on Wave 5 biological data and vital events. Hopefully you were able to attend the plenary session earlier and received a lot of great information there. I'm Dr. Chantel Martin, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Gillings School of Global Public Health and a faculty fellow at the Carolina Population Center, and will be moderating this session today. I just want to ask during this session, it looks like we have, a good number of people. If you could just remain muted throughout and enter any questions that you have in the chat box, and I will read them aloud at the end of the session during the question and answer period. I'm pleased to introduce our presenter today and my colleague, Dr. Eric Witzel. He's a professor of epidemiology, also at Gillings School of Global Public Health, and adjunct professor of medicine at the School of Medicine. Here at UNC-Chapel Hill, Eric has played an integral role in the development of AdHealth's rich biological data, and we're fortunate to have him here today to present some of these data as well as vital records that are available in Wave 5 AdHealth. Let you begin.
Great. Thanks, Chantel. I appreciate the introduction, and welcome everyone to the AdHealth virtual workshop. As Chantel mentioned, I'm Eric Witzel, and I have put my my email address on the front page here of the presentation. Feel free to reach out to me afterwards if there are questions that we don't get to today. I think we have hour and a half, something like that. I think there should be plenty of time. I wish we were in Bethesda. I look forward to doing that maybe next year or in the future, so we can have a more conversational discussion about the topic that I am going to present today remotely, which focuses on biological and vital events data at Wave 5. I will be looking back and forth between two screens here, so forgive me. Two pieces to today's conversation, biological data and vital events data. And let's just get into the first of those two, biological data, and the choice of it, which were really driven by a number of factors listed here, namely prevalent conditions among this cohort at this point in the life course, and also the processes by which these conditions lead to both health, but also, of course, to disease, and also measures that are capable of characterizing these processes. We also wanted to focus squarely on the feasibility of collecting them, the availability of data across ways because of the power of longitudinal data analysis. And then last, but certainly not least, reliability and validity of our results. With that as a backdrop, we focused on 8 different domains that are listed here, and within those domains on a number of primary measures which are tabulated. Just as a glimpse, we'll get into each set as we move forward. Tabulated here, one of the main purposes of this table is to refer to the omic measures, which will not be the focus of my discussion. And in fact, I don't want to scare anyone away. We have, it looks like 36 participants, but if your primary interest is in the omic measures, I think you should be attending Brant Levitt's presentation, moderated by Christy Avery. It's concurrent. Just wanted to give you a heads up because that is ongoing. Let's go through each one of these in turn. We'll start with the cardiovascular measures. The primary measures are fairly straightforward. Everyone has had their blood pressure measured at the doctor's office. We're talking about the systolic and diastolic blood pressures. These are arterial pressures measured during systole, which is the active contraction of the heart. So it's the higher of the two pressures, and diastole during the relaxation phase. These are the numbers that physicians give us, the top number being the systolic blood pressure, or SBP, the bottom number, the lower number being diastolic blood pressure. We also collected pulse rate. This was collected also using a blood pressure cuff. One can view it as a proxy for heart rate in this context, a fairly accurate proxy for heart rate. Now, secondarily, we derive from these primary measures pulse pressure and mean arterial pressure, and have made those available to folks. And pulse pressure is just the difference between the systolic and diastolic blood pressures. This is a pressure that goes up with age quite markedly, with stiffening of the arterial tree. And mean arterial pressure is simply a weighted average of the systolic and diastolic blood pressure that really reflects the average duration of systole and diastole. Now, these blood pressures are in our released data sets classified according to the Joint National Committee guidelines, and that's the way it was back at Wave 4. Now, what's new, what's happened in the interim is that the JNC guidelines have been supplanted by the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association guidelines, which are listed below, and I will label things in this talk as new for Wave 5 with our new label. And you can see that there are sizable differences between the classification of stage 1 hypertension under JNC guidelines versus stage 1 under ACC/AHA guidelines, stage 2 as well. Those differences, of course, need to be reflected when conducting longitudinal work. The shift in the classification primarily in part reflected information stemming from the SPRINT trial and meta-analyses, which suggested risk is elevated below the former JNC guideline levels, and interventions are actually valuable in reducing those blood pressure, valuable in reducing consequences like stroke, heart attack, and other forms of coronary heart disease. Our anthropometric measures, fairly straightforward ones, right? Weight and height, but also two circumferential measures of the waist and the arm. The waist circumference primarily to differentiate body mass from abdominal adiposity, and our arm circumferential measure primarily to size an appropriately fitting arm blood pressure cuff. If a cuff's too small and the arm's too big, the blood pressure looks higher than it should be, and vice versa. From these primary measures, we, of course, can compute body mass index, which is well known to most as the ratio of weight in kilograms to height in meters squared. And it and waist are classified in our released data sets according to the NHLBI evidence report. Waist based on thresholds of 88 in women and 102 in men, identifying folks at high risk, and BMI using the typical threshold of 25 to identify those who are overweight, and thresholds of 30, 35, and 40 kilograms per meter squared to identify stage 1 and stage 2 and stage 3 obesity. Added to the anthropometric measures, we have several metabolic measures, biomarkers. Lipids are the first subset, and our primary measures in this case are the waxy, cholesterol-laden, fatty constituents of the blood, including total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. HDL, also well known as good cholesterol, primarily because it high-density lipoprotein serves a role in moving cholesterol from cells, including those in atherosclerotic plaques, to the liver for excretion in the gut. We captured it, and then we derive from these primary measures LDL cholesterol using the Friedewald equation, which you can see only applies when the total triglyceride measure or concentration is less than 400 milligrams per deciliter. When it exceeded 400 milligrams per deciliter, we actually measured LDL cholesterol directly via assay. And then we have two other secondary measures, a ratio of total cholesterol to HDL-C, and then what's called the non-HDL cholesterol fraction, which is just the difference between total and HDL cholesterol. These measures are well known for being relatively robust in the postprandial state, so after eating, to the kind of spurious increases that we might see in LDL or triglycerides in the non-fasting state. So what's new here at Wave 5? Well, it's not that we have measures of lipids. It's that we have quantitative measures of lipids. For people who have been working in ad health for years, working with Wave 4 data, you're familiar with our nascent dried blood spot based lipid deciles that were released to users. Well, these are based on serum measures. They are quantitative and therefore classifiable, which we have accomplished using the National Cholesterol Education Program, old guidelines, and the more recent American Heart Association and American College of Cardiology guidelines to identify entities that are of interest, both in terms of prevalence and in terms of their influence on risk of future cardiovascular disease, for example. Second group of metabolic measures are our measures of glucose homeostasis, and we have two varieties there. We have glucose. Glucose is a carbohydrate, right? This is the primary energy source for cells in the body, and it goes up and down rapidly. So it gives us an acute look at glucose concentration at any given point in time. We've coupled that with a measure of glycosylated hemoglobin. Of course, it focuses on hemoglobin, which is our major oxygen-carrying protein in the body that becomes glycosylated. It has carbohydrate moieties attached to it in a manner that's proportional to the ambient glucose concentration. So what this measure gives us is an integrated quantification of the extent to which glucose is elevated over time, usually 30 to 90 days prior to the point at which hemoglobin A1C is measured. So two measures, one focused on the acute, one focused more on the chronic elevation of glucose in the human body. And of course, both of these can be classified according to American Diabetes Association guidelines. Glucose, either in the fasting or non-fasting state, using different thresholds to identify both diabetes and impaired, what's called IFG, impaired fasting glucose. And hemoglobin A1C, its value is that fasting status doesn't matter for its interpretation. Values between 5.7 and 6.4% identify those who are at demonstrably increased risk for diabetes, and those above 6.5 are said to have diabetes per se. We have a measure of inflammation, an inflammation biomarker. This is one that was also available at the prior visit. This is high sensitivity CRP. This is a protein produced in the liver. It's an acute phase reactant in the sense that it rises rapidly in response to inflammatory insults, both large and small, it being highly sensitive. And it is commonly interpreted using the CDC-AHA guidelines, where values greater than 3 milligrams per liter are identified as high, and values that are even higher really need to trigger searches for factors that could be confounding HS-CRP's relationship with outcomes of interest to the analyst. And then we have some new measures. I'm very excited about these. Unfortunately, we don't have these released yet, but these are new to Wave 5. I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead of myself. I'm going to focus on the renal biomarkers. These are biomarkers related to or pertaining to the kidney. And then I'll skip ahead to some of the measures that we have not released yet that are coming. But these renal biomarkers include creatinine and cystatin C. Creatinine, as you know, is a breakdown product of muscle protein released into the blood, filtered out by the kidney, excreted in the urine. Cystatin C is much the same. However, it is said to be more sensitive to mild impairment of kidney disease. and it was therefore selected as an adjunct to creatinine in this context. These measures can both be used and have been used to estimate glomerular filtration, the rate of glomerular filtration. What is eGFR? Well, the kidney, of course, has these primary filtering units called nephrons, and within the nephrons are the glomeruli, hard to say, that's the plural of glomerulus. In any case, the glomeruli filter the blood, and eGFR quantifies the filtration rate. You can see it's computed using a fairly complicated formula, one that's been validated by the NIDDK. It's called the CKD-EPI equation. It's based on serum creatinine and values separate constants that are used in men, in women. And analogous formulas have been used to compute the analogous eGFRs based on cystatin C or the combination of both biomarkers. And of course, those measures of eGFR can be classified, have been classified by the I'll call them the KDIGO guidelines. These are guidelines for interpreting decreases in eGFR, where values less than 60 are commonly thought of as being indicative of chronic kidney disease, and those less than 15 indicative of end-stage kidney disease or end-stage renal disease. ESRD, ESKD, you've heard those acronyms before. We have, as adjuncts to our biological data, information about prescription medications and select OTC meds, namely salicylates, which are the aspirins, right, and NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, things like ibuprofen, indomethacin, and the like. And these medications were collected. They've been subjected to therapeutic classification using the Multum lexicon, and these have yielded an exhaustive classification of our meds, with providing information about, for example, several therapeutic classes of interest to cardiovascular people interested in cardiovascular disease epidemiology or perhaps neuroepidemiology. So we can quantify, we can use this to help define diseases, help interpret our biomarkers, examine treatment and control of given diseases and the like. So why is this new? We had medication data available, similar medication data available way for it. What's new in the sense that while many people were using these classifications previously, we had not made them available as part of the release data set of Wave 4. We have now done that to try to make it a little bit easier for our users. Now, I was skipping way ahead before, but these are the other biomarkers that are pending. These are new to Wave 5 over and above what we've already released, and new compared to what was available at Wave 4. They include additional inflammatory immune biomarkers, including several cytokines and a CMV antibody titer. CMV, many of us have been infected with CMV over the course of our lives, and it's held in check by the immune system, and increases in the antibody titer are often viewed as being consistent with stress-related immune suppression. So it's a proxy for stress. Some people use it that way. We have new hepatic injury biomarkers that include a couple of enzymes, which are the first of which is found in many organs, is concentrated in the liver as well, but ALT particularly so, such that the ratio of AST to ALT when it exceeds 2 is very helpful in increasing the probability of identifying alcoholic liver disease. We're excited about the availability of all those biomarkers. And then lastly, as we move into some of the new aims of primary interest at Wave 6, we have some neurodegeneration biomarkers, including NFL and the tau protein, both of which are constituents of neurons, axons, and are released into the cerebrospinal fluid and plasma. when there's damage to the brain, the central nervous system of various types. So we're very interested in making these available to users. Okay, so that's what we measured. So how do we collect it? Collection had several parts. We'll go through each one of these at a time: scheduling, prep, interview, exams, medication inventory, phlebotomy, processing, and data upload. And the first of which is scheduling. And our field work collaborator had an event coordinator who alerted our field staff of new respondents. We made repeated calls to contact them. We scheduled appointments. We communicated the field staff communicated the scheduled dates and times back to the event coordinator, and then we sent out a reminder a few days prior to the appointment. And that way, were able to increase the odds of finding our participant when we went to their home. Weren't always successful. That was the plan. This was the scheduling. These were the scheduling priorities. They were primarily dictated by the availability of shipping services, FedEx, and the schedule of our laboratory partners, LCBR, the Laboratory for Clinical Biochemistry Research at the University of Vermont, led by Mary Cushman and her talented staff. We really prioritized weekdays over weekends. That did allow some weekend visits, but that became complicated because shipping services aren't as regularly available, and because people who work in laboratories want a day off as well. To prepare for the home visit, the field staff assembled their equipment, their supplies. They grabbed their prepackaged home visit kit, which included everything that was needed to draw blood, process it, and get it mailed to LCBR. This is a glance at what it looks like as you open it up. And they grabbed their Samsung tablet. This was critical. Why? Well, at least we thought it was critical. This was to guide the interview and examination. I mean, we had paper backup, but really this was critical because it enabled people to record health status as it was self-reported at the visit, to capture the physical measurements in real time, tailor follow-up recommendations. Of course, we measured blood pressure. We didn't want to just have somebody with a systolic 240 over diastolic 180 to send them along their merry way. We needed to tailor follow-up recommendations depending on the measurements that we made. This allowed us to do that and script those recs. It's also allowed us to inventory and in real-time code medications. We had a resident database on the tablet, and then as our field staff typed the medication names from the vials that they were looking at, it matched the names that were resident on the tablet in real time. So it saved a lot of manual coding. Manual coding was necessary for those that didn't code at that point in time. I got to handle all that, but in any case, this was a great time saver. Also guided biospecimen processing and shipping, and allowed us to control data quality. Of course, we built into the tablet range checks. Someone couldn't enter a systolic blood pressure of 15, right? That person would be unconscious. They had to double enter key data points like blood pressures, and also now enabled semi-automatic transmission of data from the tablet centrally to CPC for archival. What other equipment did we use? Well, this is some of the basic equipment. We'll quickly run through it. We used this Sika circumferential tape measure. This was used for a couple reasons. As I mentioned before, for the arm blood pressure cuff, arm circumference to dictate blood pressure cuff size, but also for waist circumference. And this was measured in centimeters and was fairly low cost. This was accompanied by a oscillometric BP monitor made by Microlife, the same piece of equipment used at the prior wave. It had a decent range of blood pressure. It could accommodate a reasonable range of blood pressure and pulses that we expected to see in this population. Accuracy was reasonable. It was approved by the British Hypertension Society. And also we had subjected it in the prior wave to a fairly rigorous series of validation protocols, which we've published on in epidemiology. This was primarily AC adapter driven, but we had battery backup, and critically 2 cuffs to accommodate the range of sometimes fairly small, but oftentimes enormous arms. We did the best we could with these 2 cuffs at the time. We're actually going to have a little bit larger cuff on the a large end of things this time to in wave 6 to be able to accommodate some of the larger arms that we've been seeing. This is our cardiovascular protocol. Of course, every bit of our protocol involved trained and certified staff. We put them through training. In this case, they rested the participants for 5 minutes. They seated them. They had their feet flat on the floor. Their legs were uncrossed. They had their arm at heart level. And they had a cuff that was matched to their arm circumference. They measured systolic, diastolic pressure and pulse rate 3 times. They did it at 30-second intervals. They double entered these numbers, and then they automatically averaged the last 2 measures, and that formed the basis for the follow-up recommendations and the results that were returned to the participant at that point in time. This is our fancy anthropometric equipment, really high tech. But actually, this post-it note is quite useful. When standing participant against a wall to measure their height, this was used to mark the top of the participant's head, and on which height, weight, and waist were recorded. Very useful. This was our healthometer, a digital scale. Load cell, not an old spring job, and you can see a high max, a necessity in today's era, and yet some people still exceeded this maximum. It's battery powered. Again, our circumferential tape, mentioned this time with waist in mind. The nice thing about this in large individuals is that it can be placed circumferentially with the participant's help assistance to around the participant. The end peg positioner can be placed in the port, and then the field staff member can go around and ensure that the tape measure is parallel to the floor, which is critical for waist circumferential measurement. This is our protocol. Of course, trained, certified staff. The participants were dressed and unchewed, preferably. I'll get back to that in just a minute. Preferably standing on an uncarpeted floor. And then we measured height, weight, and waist to the nearest ½ centimeter, 10th kilogram, and ½ centimeter, respectively. Waist was captured at the superior border of the iliac crest at the end of expiration, horizontal to the floor, as I mentioned. And we took extra care to measure shoe height and hair height for people who did not want to remove their shoes and did not want to remove hair pieces and the like. This makes reference to our medication inventory. Of course, the protocol was to ask people to assemble their meds in advance, or to remind them at the time of the exam to do that, and then to begin the inventory, to enter the meds one at a time, at which point in time when they're recognized by the tablet, they get automatically coded, and then to enter the sources, whether the information is coming from memory, or whether it was on a label or a container, or whether it was name not found in our database, which we updated quarterly. And of course, phlebotomy. That was new at wave 5. Again, at wave 4, we collected dried blood spots. That's as invasive as we got. We decided we needed to do a little bit better with our biomarkers. So we worked with trained and certified phlebotomists to obtain blood. Ideally, respondents were fasting. That wasn't always the case, but they centrifuged the blood on site. Then packaged, shipped it to LCBR, where it was assayed, and we return results to participants. With alerts, I ended up calling a good number of participants who had values in our alert range. So that's what we collected and how we collected it. Let me just share a few key results with you. I think these numbers were mentioned earlier this morning. Overall, we had about 12,300 who were surveyed at wave 5, and about 68% consented, of whom we were able to examine 64% of these participants. This is what the data looked like coming in to us. We set up a system to monitor our data in real time to keep an eye on outliers and missingness and trend and cyclicity and all of that. You can see that this pertains to visits. This is unweighted data that I will share with you all. Most popular day of the week was Monday, but we focused on weekdays. As I mentioned, very few Friday visits. Late Friday afternoon visits were not excellent for us or for participants. You can see that the modal start hour was around what, nine-ish or so. Let's skip down to the table. You see that our field staff were able to manage on average across the entire course of study about 8 visits per day, with a start time on average of about 11 a.m. But there were plenty that started quite late in the day, as you can see here. The duration of a typical visit was about 38 minutes, but there were plenty that were over an hour. You can see the distribution here. And on average, fasting status was sufficient for both the interpretation of fasting glucose and our lipids. However, I point out that there are a good number of people below this mean. So there are plenty of non-fasting participants in this context. I think it's one of the challenges of conducting research in the field and actually practice of clinical medicine as well. So what did our cardiovascular measures look like? Well, here are our primary measures. You can see the distributions over the conduct of the study. And let's just focus quickly on the average measures. 123/79 looks decent. All that diastolic blood pressure, remember, is getting pretty close to the 80 millimeter of mercury threshold that I mentioned the ACC and the AHA promulgating. So that's a bit concerning, and that's manifest here. You can see that fully 49% had a systolic blood pressure that was getting up and above the cut point of 130, or a diastolic blood pressure of over 180. So about 49% looked like they were going to meet our stage 1 hypertension threshold, and fully 19% meaning stage 2. So a high prevalence of hypertension, at least in the unweighted sample. And by clinical cut points, we're just looking at pulse rate as a proxy for heart rate. About 9%, 3% had bradycardia or tachycardia. I guess bradycardia wouldn't be terribly uncommon in a younger population. A lot of super fit people out there too. But about 3% had a pulse rate over 100 beats per minute. Let's look at waist and BMI. Again, waist is striking in the sense that large proportion were over 88, which is a threshold for women, and 102 is the threshold for men, such that fully 51% exceeded that threshold, defining high risk in this population. And similarly, good chunk of people over 25 establishing BMI as overweight or obese. So fully 75% of the population here was overweight or obese by our threshold. Turning to measures of glucose homeostasis and lipids. Again, let's look at glucose based on the fasting threshold or the non-fasting threshold that identified about 3 to 4% that met criteria for diabetes. Compare that with 4.6% based on the threshold of 6.5 here for hemoglobin A1C. Remember, 5.7 to 6.4 is that range at increased risk of diabetes. So fully 10% of the population is in that range. Then sliding down to LDL and TG, you can see 5.1% of the population had hypercholesterolemia by the threshold based on a threshold of 160, hypertriglyceridemia based on a threshold of 175. I should point out that most of these means are just slightly over the median, so there's a little right shift, a little skew to the right. TG maybe a little more, so 129 versus 102, and the standard deviation is almost as big as the mean, so a much more volatile variable distribution, not surprising given the mixture of fasting and non-fasting status. And then let's pivot to our inflammation and renal biomarkers. HSCRP, in this case, SD is quite a bit above the mean, unique among our biomarkers. So a highly variable distribution. You see the mean is far greater than the median. There's a large right tail, such that 20% actually exceed that threshold of 3 milligrams per liter. And eGFR, in this case, based on creatinine, we're looking at the opposite end of the distribution, namely for decreases in the glomerular filtration rate. Again, about 19% are falling in this decreased category, and a little less than 1% actually meet criteria. So that's down here somewhere, a little less than 1% are meeting criteria for chronic kidney disease or end-stage kidney disease. How about our medication exposures? This just gives you a quick example of some of our most commonly used cardiovascular medications, including antihypertensives. One of the reasons I included this was to point out that this percentage, 12.1%, is actually a little bit higher than that in the released data set. And we've found I was alerted about a coding error for a wild card in some of our code that was used to define this exposure. So a new data set is being prepared for release, and that should be coming out within a week or so. So if you're working with the antihypertensive data, the cardiovascular data in AdHealth, please be aware we found a problem with the data set, and a new data set will be released. But the more general point is that a lot of people are exposed to these medications, and some of the prevalences of the exposure for some of the neurological medications, antidepressants and the like, are comparably or even comparably high or even higher. And our additional inflammatory immune biomarkers, hepatic injury biomarkers, and neurodegeneration biomarkers are forthcoming. So I'm excited about these. Please keep your ears and eyes open. I'm expecting these will be fully released by early 2022, maybe February or so. Hopefully there won't be any stragglers, and maybe, but we're working hard to get those out to everybody. So when we think about these data, we have to think about the threats to their quality, and a number of those are listed here. We get concerned about these, perhaps overly concerned. We really spend a lot of time thinking about this and trying to head off these problems before they even arise. And the strategies for doing that are really to uniformly train and monitor our staff, and monitor them until they say, "Uncle." We follow our standardized protocols, use standard tested equipment, although there's been some pressure against that. We've been successful in sticking with our equipment. We automate processes. We pull humans out of the pipeline, the data pipeline. Every time a human touches it, between the point of collection and actually analysis, sometimes there are opportunities for it to go south. We try to automate that when possible. We're tracking and reducing missing data, tracking and reducing measurement error of multiple types. I won't go into all of these today, but suffice it to say is that we have standard algorithms for monitoring these over time. And I will share one of them, which I think is particularly critical, and that's namely reliability. Because if you don't have reliable data, you really can't have valid data, which is a major goal. How do we monitor reliability? Let me bring up our intra-individual variation sub-study. This is a sub-study that was embedded in wave 4, also in wave 5. We basically conducted a race, ethnicity, and sex stratified random sample of 96 participants. We examined them twice, 1 to 3 weeks apart. Target was same day a week by the same and same time of day, and same field staff person. And we took those data and we parsed the variation in those data into their components, namely the between and within participant sources of variation. We expressed that variation as an interclass correlation coefficient, which is tabulated here, namely the between participant variance divided by the total variance, namely the between plus within participant variance. And of course, an ICC that approaches 1 is excellent. On the reliability standard, you can see most of our values are approaching 1. The cardiovascular measures are probably the lowest of the group, 0.7-ish, but those rival the blood pressure reliabilities in many of the NHL BI support cohorts with which I work. So I think I'm pleased with this. Our anthropometric measures are all very close to 1. Same can be said about our measures of glucose homeostasis. A little bit lower for our lipid measures, particularly triglycerides. Again, it's known to be volatile in the non-fasting state. And then the remainder of our biomarkers, the kidney biomarkers, the kidney biomarkers and our inflammation biomarker all look really good. So people familiar with wave 4 reliability, this tops wave 4, so we're very happy about this and confident that we have some reliable biomarker data from wave 5. So I'd like to pivot to the latter part of the talk, which focuses on vital events. And we'll talk a little bit about the rationale, the surveillance system designed to capture them. I'll give you a preliminary glimpse at the results and the quality of these data. Now, this is labeled as new. It's not new to me because we've been doing this for quite a while in wave 5, but it's new compared to wave 4. It will be new to users. We plan to release some of these data later this year once we finish with these 3 components. So let me tell you a little bit more about the rationale for this study, which started in wave 5, and describe some of the approaches and results. So of course, the rationale is multifold. Our cohort is aging, right? As people move into early and middle adulthood, they're at increased risk for diseases, and diseases can lead to death. So we want to be mindful of both. But this cohort also was shouldering the burden simultaneously of the obesity epidemic, the opioid epidemic, now the COVID epidemic. But of course, back at wave 4, what we were seeing is these distributions of cardiovascular disease risk factors in the ad health population, which were a little bit scary, shifted to the right of their NHANES peers, as described in prior papers by Quinn Nguyen. So this is the surveillance system that we set up with those kinds of things in mind. It has 3 components, one of which is to trace, screen, and match participants. The next is to investigate and abstract information on these decedents. And finally, it's to review, classify, and adjudicate both cardiovascular disease outcomes among them and causes of death among them. The way this works is we start with the entire ad health cohort as assembled at wave 1, and these participants are subjected to RTI tracing, which has led to the identification of potentially deceased or unlocatable participants, who then get fed to our medical outcomes coordinator, Alyssa Trainey. Very happy to be working with her as part of the surveillance project, who screens them. And if they're sufficiently well identified, we take them forward to national death index matching. And match cases sometimes come back 1-to-1, sometimes they come back 1-to-many, and we subject them to a tried and true scoring process developed in the context of the atherosclerosis risk and communities study. and match cases are then fed forward to the investigation and abstraction stage. But anytime we get low scoring cases or unmatched cases or poorly identified cases, they go back through this loop until we get them sorted out before moving forward. Investigation and abstraction, of course, that begins by just assembling everything we already know about these people, their medical history, their history of major diagnoses, their history of substance abuse and the like over the years. And then we combine that with newly collected information, which comes from the obituary, the death certificate, health provider questionnaires among participants who have died who had a primary health care practitioner. Then we are able to capture coroner and medical examiner reports for the majority of deaths. And we do next of kin interviews for out of hospital deaths. And for those that are hospitalized, we actually go after hospital records. All these are brought back together and abstracted by the medical outcomes coordinator. And then they are subjected to review and initial classification by two physicians, one of whom is me, the other one, Laura Lair. And this is to determine cardiovascular disease outcomes and causes of death. And to the extent that there is a difference between the two reviews, the classifications, that leads to an adjudication process and final classifications of outcomes and causes of death. So that's our surveillance system in a nutshell as we've set it up. So what have we been able to do since we set this up in Wave 5? Well, we have identified 579 decedents, all but one of which have matched 1-to-1. I think one is awaiting NDI matching. So a fairly sizable number of deaths to date. This is their geographic distribution. You can see the states labeled in the deepest blue that have contributed the highest number of decedents to date: California, Texas, North Carolina, gosh, testing my geography, New York, Ohio, and good grief, is that Kentucky? And then several states we haven't, there have been no decedents to date: Maine, North Dakota, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Hawaii, and Alaska. That's the geographic distribution of deaths. This gives you some idea about the temporal distribution of deaths, which has been on the upswing. Of course, given the aging population and the cardiovascular risk factor distribution and other factors in this population. This gives you, thirdly, an idea about the demographic distribution of deaths to date. On average, young, right? 31 years of age. Of course, this is how old our cohort has been. And the deaths to date have primarily been white men, but there, more than a third have been women, and almost half have been among minority populations. How about investigation and abstraction? Well, that other than collecting what we already have in hand or assembling what we already have in hand, that has involved the execution of ad health state agreements. And I tell you, this is in some ways a major barrier to the conduct of epidemiologic research in the United States. We have to negotiate these individual agreements with all 50 US states, sometimes the US Army, the Marines, Mexico, what have you. But to date, we've been able to execute agreements with about 43 entities. I think New Hampshire and Utah are waiting in the wings. So soon enough, we'll be at 45. So we're well on our way to having all those agreements in place and don't want to dare let them expire. That's been our, you can see Alyssa Trainee gets a lot of credit for really pushing this up. It's been a little stagnant of late, but we just haven't had many deaths outside those original states that I mentioned earlier, although that's changing. We've abstracted records, you can see, for obituaries, death certificates, and autopsy reports. Between 65 and about 90% of these we have in hand. This is a plot of our progress relative to where we should be, knowing where we want to be at the end of Wave 6, which is at 100%. So in all three of these cases, we're doing better than we need to be doing on average. And you can see that despite some delay during the COVID epidemic, and during the interim, the interwave period, we're starting to pick up again with all of these making progress. The one difficult challenge here is hospital records. Again, COVID-related delays here. We're starting to pick up again, but this is a challenge. Despite this kind of research and access to hospital records being allowable under federal statute, there are a number of challenges at each hospital of the many hospitals around the country that actually admit people before they die. So how about a little bit about quality of these data as they come in from these separate forms? These are preliminary measures. The agreement looks pretty good, as do the Kappa coefficients, and you can look for the hospital records. The biomarker specific interclass correlation coefficients are also pretty high. This is based on a random sample or random samples of decedents, one of which oversampled decedents with cardiovascular disease 3 to 1. So we're happy about this, but in the cases where we find discrepant reviews, it's been a wonderful tool to improve our question by question instructions that we give to abstractors and to improve the abstraction forms and the like. So a very helpful tool and reassuring tool. What does this let us to conclude? Well, to date, again, these are not physician review classified and adjudicated, but this is preliminary data from the death certificate and from ICD codes via NDI. While the majority remain accidental deaths, there is a large proportion of which are classified as natural deaths. And some of the leading causes other than other include cardiovascular disease and cancer, which we fully expect these have been on the rise over the last few years as a proportion of the total count. And you can see here COVID-19 has made its way into the causes of death for this younger group, right? COVID is not necessarily a disease of older people. Lastly, review, classification, and adjudication, as I mentioned, is in progress. So in summary, regarding the Wave 5 biological data, we have it in hand. We have weights. We have the biomarker weights. We have great documentation in terms of user guides and the like. Biospecimens are available. A nice sample size, around 5,400. The data quality looks high. Check out the user guides, which help document that, help people use it. And then we have some really neat inflammatory, immune, hepatic injury, and neurodegeneration biomarkers that are pending. We hope to have to you in less than a year. So that's really exciting. And then with respect to our vital events, our death and CVD outcomes events is ongoing. 579 deaths to date, a third or more due to natural causes. The quality looks pretty high, and the review, classification, and adjudication are ongoing. So please stay tuned regarding the pending release of these data sets. We want people to be working with these, and please consider ancillary studies that leverage this kind of information, right? That's one of our goals here at Wave 6. Let me just end by acknowledging the supporters and the designers of AdHealth. There are many.